Hello everyone, thank you for joining me. This is lecture 8 of my short course on livelihood research. This lecture is about decoloniality in livelihood research. My name is Leo and I'm from the Netherlands. Give me a moment to share my screen. I am Emeritus Professor of Development Studies. Before my retirement, I was Rector of the Institute of Social Studies in The Hague in the Netherlands. The ISS is the oldest and leading development studies institute in the world. Before my appointment at ISS, I directed the African Studies Center in Leiden, the largest center of its kind in Europe. I was trained as human geographer, and throughout my academic career, I have focused my research on livelihoods in Africa. This course is on the MA level, and it is open to all interested students anywhere in the world. The purpose of the short course is to make you familiar with livelihood research and to inspire you to use it. The course also has a second objective, call it a reflective objective. That reflective objective is about contextualizing livelihood research against the backdrop of a critical assessment of development studies itself. Any topical interpretation and practice of livelihood research can only be achieved through this second objective. The purpose of this lecture 8 is to decolonize livelihood research, and therefore I have to start with contextualization. More precisely, I start with a critical confrontation of development studies with decoloniality and post-colonialism. Decoloniality is, according to one of its founders, the Peruvian social scientist Aníbal Quinjani, a critique on the way science, in other words, knowledge production, including development studies, operates. Decoloniality aims to dispose knowledge production of Eurocentric viewpoints. Decoloniality criticizes the supposedly universality of those viewpoints and the knowledge it produces. Decoloniality is not the same as decolonization, nor is coloniality the same as colonialism. Maldonado Torres, a Puerto Rico scholar, explains that colonialism is when the sovereignty of a people or nation is held by another nation. Although colonialism has ended with decolonization, coloniality survived. Coloniality are patterns of power, which were established during colonialism, but which continue ever since. It's being reproduced in cultural patterns, in common sense, in the self-image of people, in aspiration of self, and in many other aspects of modern life. It is also alive in books, in scientific work, in the rules of the scientific game, such as criteria for academic performance. Maldonado Torres argues that in a way, you and me, modern subjects, breathe coloniality all the time and every day. So important structures of colonial domination are still operating. For example, during colonization, differences between conquerors and conquered, between colonial oppressors and colonial subject, became codified. This codification gave way to the idea of race as a supposedly different biological structure. The codification created new identities, for example, Indians and blacks, and placed them in a natural position of inferiority, placing whites and Europeans in a position of superiority at the same time. The lighter one's skin, the closer to full humanity. Another arrangement of colonial domination was the establishment of new structures of control over labor and resources. First in the form of slavery and serfdom, and later in the form of petty producers, depending on the capitalist world market. So our modern world is impregnated with coloniality, and coloniality continues to be an inevitable outcome of modern discourses. Decoloniality is often mentioned in one and the same breath as postcolonialism. Postcolonialism is the study of the cultural legacy of colonialism and imperialism. Postcolonialism argues that colonialism produced its own specific theories to facilitate and justify its dominance over other peoples and nations. Through these theories, colonialists understood and knew the world. Postcolonialism wants to disempower such theories by establishing intellectual spaces where people, which were excluded from the hierarchy of colonial power, can now speak for themselves and develop their own discourses. Palestine scientist Edward Said, by the way, honorary doctor of my institute ISS, is generally considered the founding father of postcolonialism. He argued in his book Orientalism that colonial European powers created an image of the Orient, that is the East, as inferior and backward, exotic, irrational and wild, while portraying Western Europe as superior, progressive, rational. This is what we now call othering, that is, defining another group as inferior on the basis of race, geography, class, culture, or gender, and distancing oneself from that group. Orientalism reduced the rich variety of people and cultures of the Middle East, the Indian subcontinent, and of Asia in general into one homogeneous inferior cultural identity and entity, the Orient, which justifies its colonization and oppression by the West. At the same time, Orientalism, this particular form of othering, also prevented the peoples and the cultures in question to express and represent themselves as distinct. Though decoloniality is often mentioned in the same breath as postcolonialism, Gourminder Brambra, professor of postcolonial and decolonial studies, argue that although they have much in common, they are not the same. Postcolonialism finds its origin with authors from the Middle East and South Asia, and decoloniality originates from Latin America. She explains that decoloniality pulls the time horizon of coloniality back much earlier than postcolonialism, namely to the colonization of the Americas, and includes not only Western Europe but also Spain and Portugal. It follows that already at its origin, modernity was fully intertwined with coloniality. Now it's time to move on to the second part of the lecture. What to do about it? How to move from coloniality to decoloniality in livelihood research. The Zimbabwean scholar Sabelo Ndlovu-Katseni calls on us to rethink thinking. Rethinking thinking is nurturing a decolonial attitude in knowledge production. It is a painstaking exercise to unthink some of the presumptions of knowledge that has been polluted by Eurocentralism. The overrepresentation of European thought in knowledge, social theory, and education must be tackled. Ndlovu-Katseni wants us to provincialize Europe and to de-Europeanize the world in order to get rid of that overrepresentation. Provincializing Europe will give way to deprovincializing Africa, that is to tackle the underrepresentation of Africa in knowledge production. According to Ndlovu-Katseni, decolonizing knowledge production will achieve epistemic freedom. Epistemic freedom means related to the nature and ground of knowledge. Epistemic freedom is much more than an academic freedom, which is about the freedom of universities to produce knowledge without unreasonable interference of restrictions. Epistemic freedom is an essential prerequisite to achieve political, economic, and cultural freedom. At the center of epistemic freedom is debunking the idea of Europe as the teacher of the world and the idea of Africa as a pupil. So decoloniality is also a matter of dismantling power hierarchies in knowledge production, in science. More or less along the same lines, decoloniality writers Chostelin Vanovo and Mignola, respectively a Caucasian Central Asian scholar and an Argentine scholar, argue that we must unlearn. According to them, no one, decolonial scholars included, can step out of the colonial matrix. We are impregnated by coloniality and cannot pretend to be outsiders or observers who may show new decoloniality pathways of scholarly work. But they say we can unlearn the colonial designs. Interestingly, they also show a way to unlearn. They propose to unlearn and relearn by learning from the very communities often met in livelihood research, communities of excluded people. In sum, coloniality should be unlearned, and because we scholars are so impregnated with coloniality, unlearning should take place by learning from communities excluded by coloniality. And at this point I feel that I have arrived at the limit of my teaching you livelihoods research. As from here my own positionality comes into play. Didn't Lovo argue that at the center of epistemic freedom is debunking the idea of Europe as a teacher of the world and the idea of Africa as a pupil? So here I am, an old white and European professor, having directed major centers in Europe of scholarly work on developing countries in Africa, influential centers, which in many instances have set the tone in development studies and in Africa studies, and possibly, if not undoubtedly, impregnated with colonial matrix. Therefore, lecturing should stop here, and a searching conversation between us should take over, in an attempt to unlearn and relearn and achieve epistemic freedom. What I have to bring to the conversation are three unripe thoughts that might serve as suggestions for the unraveling colonial gazes in livelihood research. The first is on the genealogy of livelihoods research. The second is on poverty, social exclusion and intersectionality. And the third is on decolonizing methodologies. The rising popularity of livelihood research as of the late 1990s was not only due to its promotion by development organizations like DFID. The concept of livelihoods also fell back on well-known and often older approaches in various disciplines evoking recognition. As you know, I was trained as a human geographer, and in the regional geography of France in the 19th century, livelihoods were called genre de vie, meaning the entity of livelihood strategies of a human group in a specific region. In this region, the interaction with the natural environment was considered crucial for features of livelihoods. The genre de vie was regarded as a more or less closed regional system of livelihood strategies and the natural environment. I apply the concept of genre de vie loosely in my book on the conflicts over land and grazing areas between livestock keepers and farmers in Benin in the 1990s. Because of my limited genre de vie gaze, I mainly focused on man-land relations without exploring historical and colonial backgrounds or internal power relations, political interests, and the formation of ethnic identities. With hindsight, that was a serious fault in my study, caused by my uncritical learning of outdated concepts. Whereas I should have known better, because a few years earlier I published a book on the northern region of Togo, using a much more fruitful concept of peripheral capitalism, analyzing extensively the integration of the region in the colonial system and, as a consequence, the fundamental changes in local livelihoods, such as decades-long labor migration to neighboring countries, distorted agricultural production, and local political power struggles. Another line of descent of livelihood research can be traced to anthropology. Evans Pritchett introduced the concepts of livelihood in his study in the early 1940s on the Nuer in Sudan. He gave his book the subtitle, A Description of the Modes of Livelihood and Political Institutions. The book inspired many livelihood studies by anthropologists, while Pritchett had ignored the presence of the colonial powers and the changes it brought to the Nuer's livelihoods. His colonial gaze induced a blind spot for colonialism. Another colonial gaze may conceal itself in the characterization of poverty. In the preceding lectures, I have often referred to the poor as the focus of livelihood research. Alleviating poverty can mount on much public support, but there are two pitfalls. First, paternalistic attitudes towards those pitiful poor are lurking. Second, a focus on poverty reduces people's livelihood to material issues only. But livelihood should be taken more broadly, more holistic, integrating material and immaterial spheres of people's lives. In addition, remembering our discussion in Lecture 5 on intersectionality and social exclusion. Following the discussion on coloniality and decoloniality, the analysis of intersectionality should explicitly include race as one of the specific intersecting social divisions. Intersectionality may be a useful method to unravel coloniality. Decolonial scholars Tostanavo and Mignolo tells us to unlearn and relearn through knowledge and understanding generated by the people and communities that have been excluded. This requires critical reflections throughout the research process. And the Education Studies program of the University of Warwick have formulated the following recommendations or questions. First, what purposes does the research serve? Is the researcher in a way representing dominant groups in society? Second, what relationship does the researcher have with those being researched? The researcher is accountable to the community involved, and those doing the research must give back to the community they study. In contrast, dominant research paradigms value distance from those being researched, often for reasons of objectivity and bias. Third, extending the previous point, research should have an action orientation, and researchers should work and seek change together with the communities they study. Knowledge production should be based on alliances of researchers and communities. 4. Who conducts the research? Decolonizing researchers argue that indigenous communities are often not represented or underrepresented in academia, and hence their voices and concerns are not heard. Non-indigenous researchers can research indigenous communities, but this will call for a more critical analysis of their own standpoints and more collaborative ways of working. Radical voices would argue that there are limits on non-indigenous researchers' involvement, and researchers should not talk about what they don't know. Fifth, are bodies of knowledge distorted? Decolonization researchers seek to explain how discourse affects the way we look to subordinate people. For example, views on Arab people generated by Orientalism. We should be aware of such distortions and consider alternative or counter-hegemonic sources. These counter-narratives might have to be actively thought out. Sixth, how is research methodology itself distorted by a dominant tradition? Methodology is usually derived from Western Enlightenment assumptions about individualism, the separation of mind from body, and rationalism. This tradition puts positive approaches on top when it comes to carrying out research. But for example, indigenous communities in New Zealand view land, body, mind, and spirit as interconnected, and this poses a radical critique of the assumptions of positive approaches. As I said in my introduction, decolonizing livelihood research is a matter of searching conversations between us in order to unlearn and relearn and achieve epistemic freedom. I cannot decolonize livelihoods research on my own. We need to do that together. So I'm very much looking forward to meeting you in the online class to unlearn and relearn livelihood research. To prepare for that online class on decoloniality and livelihood research, you need to complete some coursework. This short course on livelihood research uses the so-called flipped classroom model. This usually means that students go through lower levels of cognitive learning during their preparation before class starts. This enables students to engage in higher levels of learning in class with fellow students and the lecturer. YouTube viewers can also take this short course through a flipped classroom. In practice, this means that for each lecture, your coursework consists of 5 successive parts. A video lecture with PowerPoint of around 20 minutes, which can be found on this YouTube channel. So start your preparations by watching the recorded video when it suits you. Second, if you are interested, there is also mandatory literature to read. The mandatory literature clarifies issues already discussed in the lecture. To a large extent, you encounter again the issues of the lecture, but the mandatory literature also examines some issues more in depth. Third, if you like, I can also provide optional literature. Optional literature presents additional explanations on relevant issues and offers practical, contemporary, and inspiring examples on how to organize research on particular issues. Of course, you are advised to read the optional literature attentively, but if you have little time, you should at least glance through it. Or I can send you an assignment. The assignment enables you to apply the subject material discussed in the lecture and mandatory literature. And fifth, finally, after having completed these 4 steps, I offer you the opportunity to participate in online classes, either individually or in small groups. Date and time of online classes will depend on your wishes and what your schedule allows. During that online class, 1 class per lecture, you will have the opportunity to raise questions for clarification, to formulate critique, and then to engage in applying the subject material by discussing the assignment. It's best to complete steps 1 to 4 before moving on to the next lecture, and it's mandatory for participation in the online class. The reason for that is simple. By completing these 4 steps first, you will have achieved already the lower levels of cognitive learning. And it means that the online class will become much more productive, fruitful, challenging, because we can focus and engage on higher levels of learning. So start your lecture of this short course on livelihood research by viewing the video in YouTube. On your request per email, I will make available various materials, a document explaining the didactical approach, the mandatory and optional literature, and the assignment. Don't worry, all docs are open access. Date and time of the online class will depend on your wishes and what your schedule allows. So thank you for now, and thank you for watching the video. And I hope to see you in my online class, this time the online class on decoloniality in livelihood research. A searching conversation, I hope, between us. Bye-bye, hope to see you again.